The outpost had been decommissioned for 60 years, which meant the structural integrity was in the category Tavish Orr's assessment forms, labeled as compromised but navigable. A category he had developed personally after 5 years of entering buildings that the official forms had no good language for. The floors held. The atmospheric seals had degraded to approximately 60%, which his equipment handled, and the lighting system had given up entirely, which his headlamp handled. And the overall experience was the experience of every decommissioned outpost he had ever assessed, which was the experience of walking through a place that had been significant to people who were no longer present, and had left behind only the weight of their absence. He worked methodically, room by room, cataloging with the flat precision of a man for whom other people's discarded things had stopped being poignant and become, simply, inventory. Display cases, condition, deteriorated. Furniture, condition, non-recoverable. Technical equipment, condition, salvage value marginal. He noted and moved on because the completion deadline was in 4 hours and the outpost had 17 rooms, and sentimentality was not a line item on any assessment form he had ever been given. The sealed room was at the end of the eastern corridor, behind a door that had been locked with a mechanism so old that his standard entry tools did not recognize its interface, which required him to spend 11 minutes locating and applying a manual override that the door had apparently been designed to accept and had been waiting, with the patience of inanimate objects, to receive. The room beyond it was smaller than he expected. A single case on a single shelf, under a preservation field that had continued operating on residual power for 60 years, because it had been built by someone who understood that the thing inside it was not allowed to deteriorate. The metal was circular, perhaps 10 centimeters in diameter, heavy in the way of objects whose density exceeds what their size implies. His scanner attempted a material classification and returned a result he had not seen before. Unknown alloy, pre-standard composition, age estimate 400 years plus or minus 20. The script on its surface was dense and fine, and his translation suite offered him corrupted and unreadable, which was not uncommon with script this old. And he accepted this, logged the artifact as Category 3 unidentified cultural, and put it in his jacket pocket because the preservation case was a 40-centimeter cube, and his collection kit was full, and he was going to transfer it at the shuttle. He forgot about it because there were 16 more rooms and a deadline. He forgot about it through the remainder of the assessment, which was thorough, and produced the kind of results that thorough assessments of 60-year-old decommissioned outposts produce, which is to say, mostly non-recoverable, marginally salvageable, one item of potential historical interest pending further analysis, Category 3. He forgot about it on the shuttle, where he updated his preliminary forms and ate a sandwich that was adequate, and looked out the viewport at the slow approach of Vithrin adjacent, which was a station he had docked at perhaps 30 times, and which had the specific familiarity of a place you know without knowing anything particular about it. He forgot about it through docking, through kit stowage, through the walk from the secondary bay toward the assessor's office on level 4, which the station's directional system routed through the east concourse, a route he had taken before and which had previously not passed through a diplomatic wing, a discrepancy that he noted with the mild irritation of someone who has been using a system long enough to notice when it has been updated without being informed. The diplomatic wing was marked with the amber boundary indicators of a restricted zone, which he registered approximately 3 seconds after he had already entered it, which was 3 seconds too late, which was consistent with the signage having been placed in a position that served the regulatory requirement of existing without serving the practical requirement of being visible in advance. The guards were 4, in the configuration of a perimeter that had already closed before he finished processing that he had walked into one. They were in the formal attire of an imperial delegation, structured, precise, and carrying the authority of people who represent something old enough that authority has stopped being something they perform and become something they simply have. They communicated the situation to him efficiently and without hostility, in the manner of people for whom this was a defined category of event with a defined procedure, and he communicated back that the signage was inadequate, which they received with the neutrality of people who had heard this before and found it neither convincing nor relevant. His hands were secured. He was being escorted. The metal shifted in his pocket, the motion of being walked somewhere generating a small movement that brought it partially free of the fabric, so that it was visible at his hip, hanging at the edge of his pocket, catching the light of the diplomatic wing's formal lighting in the way of an object that is very old and made of something that knows how to hold light rather than simply reflect it. He was being walked past the entrance to the formal reception chamber when the woman inside it saw him. He did not see her immediately. He was focused on the guards and the corridor and the calculation of how long this administrative inconvenience was likely to take. He became aware of her presence through a change in the guards, a sudden, collective, full-body stillness of the kind that does not happen when nothing significant is occurring, and that caused him to look. She was tall, composed in the specific way of someone whose composure is both genuine and structural, built into the way she occupied space, the way she stood, the angle of her long ears, which were in the precise managed position of someone for whom every physical expression is a considered statement. She was looking at the metal with an expression that was the most unmanaged thing about her, that had broken through the composed surface the way something breaks through ice, not gradually, but all at once. She crossed the distance between herself and the corridor in 4 steps. She went to her knees on the floor in front of him, in front of Tavish or Salvage Assessor, whose hands were currently secured behind him, and who was processing this with the specific cognitive effort of a man trying to apply a familiar framework to a situation that the framework was not built for. The guards had stopped. Everyone in the visible range of the corridor had stopped. The diplomatic wing held its breath. Tavish looked down at the Empress of the Dassery, kneeling on the floor of her own diplomatic reception, and then at the medal at his hip, and then back at the Empress, and said, because it was the only thing available to him that was honest and not alarming, I think there may have been a misunderstanding. The release from custody was immediate in the sense that the decision was made immediately, and complicated in the sense that implementing it required a sequence of procedural steps that nobody in the room had been trained for, because the training assumed a defined set of outcomes, and this was not one of them. Tavish stood in the corridor while 3 guards consulted quietly, and a 4th stood at a respectful distance that was notably different from the distance guards maintained near a detainee. Sivara had risen smoothly, without any indication that what had just occurred had cost her anything in terms of the composed authority she had returned to, and was standing at the entrance to the reception chamber issuing instructions in rapid Dassery that his translation collar was still calibrating to, producing a partial rendering that he understood was urgent and official, and directed at people who were now moving with the focused efficiency of an imperial staff that has been given clear direction. He was escorted to a formal reception room. The deference of the escort was a different animal than the deference he had received from the guards during his arrest, which had been 0, and the difference was significant enough to be slightly alarming in a new direction. The historian arrived in 11 minutes. She was a small woman whose age was indeterminate in the way of people who have spent so long being intellectually engaged that their face has not had time to settle into anything so simple as old. And she came through the door with the barely contained energy of someone for whom professional composure and personal urgency are in active negotiation. She was carrying a data tablet that she was already reading as she walked, which Tavish considered either impressive or dangerous depending on the floor surface. She looked at him. She looked at the medal, which he had taken from his pocket at the guard's request, and which now sat on the table between them. She looked at him again with the expression of a person confronting the resolution of a 40-year question, and finding that resolution is more disorienting than continued mystery. "Where did you find it?" she asked, in standard that was precise and slightly breathless. He told her. The outpost, the sealed room, the preservation case, the scanner's inability to classify the material. She listened with the focused attention of someone for whom each detail was a piece of a framework she had been building her entire career. Then she told him what it was. The seal of Vorin. He heard the name with the quality of hearing a reference he is supposed to recognize and does not, which in his experience usually meant a gap in his education rather than an error in the speaker. The historian registered his non-recognition and recalibrated, producing the kind of compressed historical account that people give when they have decades of material and a limited window, and have learned, through practice, what can be cut. Vorin, near extinction period, appeared, acted, disappeared, seal left behind as the only evidence, 400 years, prophecy, return of the seal at the moment of equivalent crisis carried by a successor bearing Vorin's mark. Tavish processed this. "What mark?" he said. The historian looked at his left arm with the specific focus of someone who has rehearsed this question in their imagination many times without expecting to ask it in a real room. "May I?" she said. He rolled up his sleeve. The birthmark on his left forearm was the size of a thumbprint, irregular at the edges in the way of birthmarks, a shade darker than his surrounding skin, and had been there his entire life without ever being anything except a birthmark. The historian made a sound. It was a very small sound, and it contained a very large amount of information, most of it emotional, none of it immediately translatable. Sivara, from her position at the edge of the room, looked at the mark with her long ears fully forward. Involuntary, unmanaged, the physical expression of something that had broken through the careful management. And said, in a voice that was quieter than imperial voices are usually permitted to be, "He is real." Tavish looked at the birthmark on his own arm. He had looked at it perhaps 10,000 times in his life, and it had never been anything except a birthmark. It was still a birthmark. It was apparently also an old Dassery script, the word for continuation. "Right," he said, with the composure of a man who has decided that whatever is happening, maintaining equanimity is the only variable he currently controls. "Could someone explain to me exactly what I'm continuing?" They explained it in the way that complicated things are explained to people who have just become central to them. In layers, each one revealing the next. The full picture assembling itself not in a single account, but across the first day and into the second. Through briefings and consultations, and 2 conversations with the historian that ran longer than anyone, scheduled them for because Tavish asked precise questions and the historian found, for the first time in 4 decades of scholarship, someone whose questions were improving her understanding, rather than requiring her to simplify it. The Dassery Empire's internal crisis was not a simple thing, and no one who briefed him pretended it was, which he noted as either a sign of respect or a sign that the situation was too visible to manage with the usual diplomatic smoothing. The succession dispute was the surface layer, a legitimate question about the imperial line that had become, through the intervention of the third faction, a destabilization instrument rather than a constitutional process. The reformist faction was real, and its arguments had merits that Tavish, reading the documentation, found difficult to dismiss. The third faction, which the formal briefings called the Continuance Council, and which the historian called, in private, the people who want the war there pretending they're trying to prevent, had been positioning itself for 2 years, and the arrival of a living Voran successor carrying the authenticated seal was the variable it had not built into its calculations. He became aware of this in the way you become aware of complicated political situations when you are suddenly their focal point. Quickly, uncomfortably, and with the persistent sensation of not knowing which of the people briefing him had a position on him that they were managing rather than reporting. The first attempt on his life was professional in its construction and unsuccessful, because Sivara's personal guard was better at their job than the attempt had accounted for. Tavish was not present for its resolution in any active sense. He was in an interior room reviewing documentation, and was informed afterward with the careful language of people who want to communicate that a thing happened without communicating the extent to which it almost happened differently. The second attempt he handled himself, which was less because he was capable and more because it occurred in a section of the diplomatic station's lower level, where the flooring was original construction from the station's first build, 200 years old, maintained cosmetically rather than structurally, carrying the load of contemporary foot traffic on a foundation designed for a lighter era. He had assessed the floor the previous day with the automatic professional attention of someone who has spent 5 years walking into buildings and evaluating what they could actually bear, and he had noted the specific section that could not. When the attempt came, he was in that section, and the person making the attempt was not, and Tavish used the difference with the practical simplicity of a man who has nothing heroic in his skill set and something very reliable instead. He was in the secure room afterward, updating his notes with the methodical calm of someone whose hands do not shake because they have decided shaking is not a useful response, when Sivara arrived, without her guard, without her full formal configuration, with the composed, controlled presence she always carried, and underneath it, visible only because he had been watching her for 2 days with the assessment attention he applied to everything, something that was personal rather than imperial. "You used the floor," she said. "The floor was the most reliable variable available," he said. She looked at him for a moment with her ears in the forward position that he had learned was her unguarded register. "The historian says you've read everything." I read what I was given. I have questions about what I wasn't given. Such as, he looked at the documentation spread on the table, at the seal which had been returned to him, a decision whose symbolism was apparently significant and whose practicality he appreciated, at the birthmark on his forearm, which he had been looking at differently for 2 days without it looking any different. What did Voren actually do? He said. Specifically, the accounts say he acted with decisive courage at enormous personal cost. That is a description of a category, not an event. What did he do? Sivara sat down. It was, he had noticed, a thing she did when she had decided that a conversation was going to be real rather than managed, the physical commitment of sitting, of being in a room as a person rather than as an empress. She sat across from him and told him. The telling took 2 hours, and Tavish listened with the quality of attention he had developed over 5 years of being the person in the room whose job was to see clearly rather than conveniently. Voren had not won a battle. He had not defeated an enemy, had not possessed any military capacity that the dassery of his era had not already had access to. What Voren had possessed, what the dassery of the near-extinction period had catastrophically lacked, was the quality of being outside. Outside the imperial structure, outside the political machinery, outside the institutional instinct to protect the governing framework at the expense of the people it governed. The near-extinction had not been an external threat. It had been a decision, a series of decisions made by an imperial council that had accurate information about the nature of the crisis, and had managed that information in the way that power structures manage information that threatens them, which is to make it unavailable to anyone whose response to it might be inconvenient. The Empire had been dying of a lie it was telling itself, and every person inside the structure had either participated in the lie or been unable to see it from inside the structure's walls. Voren had walked in from outside and said what he saw, not with eloquence, not with particular political skill, with precision, with the flat, assessor's quality of a person who looked at what was actually present and described it in terms that could not be reinterpreted as faction politics because they had no faction attached to them. The Imperial Council had tried to dismiss him. The people of the Empire, hearing him speak in the public forums that the Council had not yet fully controlled, had recognized the quality of what he was offering, not comfort, not leadership, but accuracy, and had responded to it with the response that truth generates when it arrives in a room that has been running on managed information long enough to have forgotten what accuracy feels like. The Empire had been given the truth. The Empire had chosen correctly. The crisis had been survived. Voren had disappeared, and the dassery had built into the bedrock of their political culture the understanding that the Empire's continued survival required, periodically, someone from outside the structure who could see it clearly. And the prophecy of the seal's return was not a prophecy of a hero, but of a function. The function of honest external assessment. The function of someone with nothing to gain and no position to protect and no reason to describe anything as other than what it was. Tavish sat with this for a long moment. He thought about 5 years of decommissioned outposts and Category 3 artifacts and assessment forms that asked for the actual value of things rather than the presented value. He thought about the professional satisfaction, quiet, consistent, unremarked, of telling people what their things were actually worth, of refusing to round the number in a direction that would be more comfortable. You need someone to assess the Empire, he said. I need someone the factions cannot dismiss as a faction, Sivara said. Someone whose only credential is that he has no stake in the outcome and no reason to lie. She looked at the seal on the table. The prophecy is not about a person, it is about a quality. The seal identifies the quality. The quality being that I walked into your wing by accident because the signage was inadequate. Something moved across Sivara's face. The thing he had been watching for 2 days. The thing that broke through the imperial surface in the specific moments when she was being real rather than managing being real. It was brief, controlled, and the closest thing to a smile he had yet seen from her. The signage, she said carefully, was placed where it was placed by the station's diplomatic coordinator. I have not yet determined whether this was an error. Tavish looked at her. You arranged for me to walk into the restricted zone. The coordinator made a decision about signage placement, she said, in the voice of someone reporting a fact. That is not a denial. No, she said, and her ears moved to the fully forward position, and she held his gaze with the directness of someone who has decided that this particular conversation is one she is not going to manage. It is not, He looked at the seal. He looked at the documentation. He looked at the birthmark on his forearm, which was a thumbprint shape in old Dassery script, which said continuation, which had been on his arm his entire life and had been waiting, with the patience of a thing that does not know it is waiting, for the moment when its context arrived. "I want the full documentation," he said. "Everything, not the diplomatic version, the primary sources. You will have it, and I want a day to read it before I speak to anyone officially." "Agreed. And I want it noted formally that my assessment will be accurate rather than useful, which are not always the same thing, and that I will not adjust the assessment based on which conclusion is more convenient for which faction." Sivara looked at him steadily. "That," she said, "is precisely why the seal found you. The session before the full Imperial Council took place on the 4th day, in a chamber that had been conducting significant Imperial business for 200 years, and that showed it. In the weight of the architecture, in the quality of the silence before proceedings began, in the way the room organized itself around the expectation of consequence. Tavish sat at the assessor's position, a designation he had been given, which he appreciated for its accuracy. With the full documentation spread across his tablet, and the seal on the table beside him, and the specific quality of preparation that comes from having spent a day reading primary sources with genuine attention. The factions were arranged in the chamber with the careful geometry of people who have been in rooms like this many times, and have learned to communicate their positions through proximity and positioning before a word is spoken. The traditionalists were composed and watchful. The reformists were composed and watchful in a different way, the way of people who expect to disagree with what is said and are prepared for it. The Continuance Council, the third faction, the one the historian had named privately, were composed and watchful in the way of people who have made a calculation and are waiting to see if it holds. Tavish looked at the room. He looked at it with the same flat, professional attention he gave to decommissioned outposts. Not with judgment, not with political reading, but with the assessor's instinct for what is load-bearing and what is decorative, for what will hold and what will give underweight. He delivered his assessment. It took 40 minutes. It was not eloquent. It was precise. The document-by-document account of what the primary sources showed, what the succession dispute actually turned on versus what it was being used for, what the Continuance Council's position required in terms of conditions that did not currently exist and would need to be manufactured, and what manufacturing them would cost in terms that were not political abstractions but specific. Innumerable categories of harm. He used the language of his forms. He used the language of a man who has spent 5 years telling people what things are worth, which is the language of someone who has learned that accuracy is not the same as comfort, and that the value of assessment is precisely that it is not adjusted for convenience. The chamber was not quiet during the assessment. It was the kind of not quiet that a room produces when the people in it are responding internally to things that decorum prevents them from responding to externally. The held stillness of people who are being told something true, and finding the experience uncomfortable in the specific way of truth that has been delayed. The Continuance Council's lead representative attempted an interruption at the 20-minute mark. Tavish paused, acknowledged the interruption, noted that the point being raised appeared in the documentation on page 47 of the primary source he was currently addressing, and continued. The representative did not interrupt again. At the end, the chamber did what chambers do after significant assessments. It argued. The argument was complicated and political and heated in the specific way of rooms where power is genuinely at stake, and Tavish sat through it with the patience of a man who has delivered his assessment and understands that what happens after delivery is the client's responsibility, not the assessor's. The Continuance Council's position did not collapse in the room. It began to collapse, the slow structural failure of something that has been built on conditions it requires to remain unexamined, encountering the specific load of examination. The succession dispute acquired, through the forced engagement with primary sources, a framework for arbitration that was harder to dismiss than the versions that had been available before. The room did not resolve. Rooms like this do not resolve in a single session, and anyone who expects them to is either inexperienced or managing expectations they know are false. But the seal was entered into the Imperial record as authenticated. The mark on his forearm was documented. The assessment was logged. And the Continuance Council's lead representative, leaving the chamber, had the expression of a person whose calculation has developed a structural problem and who knows it. Tavish updated the artifact catalog entry that evening in the temporary quarters that the station had assigned him, which were, he noted, considerably better than the standard assessor's accommodation he had been expecting, a discrepancy he was choosing not to examine too closely. One additional entry, Seal of Voron, material classification pending advanced analysis, cultural significance. Significant condition, intact provenance, established current status, imperial record authenticated. He was adding the location notes when the door opened. Sivara came in without her guard, without the formal configuration of an official visit, carrying 2 cups of something in the manner of someone who has decided that the distance available to her is not the distance she intends to maintain. She set 1 cup in front of him and sat down across the workbench in the chair that was there for the purpose. The second chair that his temporary quarters contained, and that he had not, until this moment, had occasion to consider the presence of. The drink was warm, slightly bitter in the way of things that are not trying to be sweet, and was apparently what the Dassery drank after events that required recovery rather than celebration. A distinction, Sivara told him, that their culture considered important enough to have specific beverages for. The council will meet again in 3 days, she said. I'll have a follow-up assessment ready. That is not what I came to discuss. He looked at her. Her ears were in the forward position, the unguarded register, the one he had been cataloging across 4 days and had come to understand as the expression she wore when she was present as a person rather than managing being present as an empress. What did you come to discuss? He said. She looked at the seal on the table between them. It sat there as it had sat everywhere, with the patient quality of something that has been waiting a long time and has arrived, and is now simply present in the room where it is meant to be. Voron disappeared, she said. The records say he left no account of why, no explanation. He completed the function the seal identified him for and he left. She looked at Tavish. I have wondered for a long time whether he chose to leave, or whether the structure he had entered made remaining impossible. Tavish looked at the seal. He thought about the decommissioned outpost and the preservation case and the 60 years of waiting that had produced, this week, something that was not what any of the parties involved had planned and was, in his provisional assessment, considerably more interesting than what they had planned. I'm a salvage assessor, he said. My company has 3 more contracted assessments this quarter, all of them within sector range. He picked up the cup. The assessor's office on Vithrin adjacent is on level 4. I know how to get there now without walking through any restricted zones. He looked at her. I'm in no particular hurry to leave. Sivara looked at him with her ears fully forward, and something in her expression that had come through the managed surface and had not gone back. And that was, he was fairly certain, applying the same assessment attention he applied to everything, not going to go back. The signage on the East Concourse, she said, has been corrected. I noticed. I corrected it myself. I know. That is, she said in the quiet voice that was not the imperial voice, a significant admission. It is, Tavish said. I've logged it. Outside, Vithrin adjacent turned in its mid-sector orbit, and the Dassery Empire continued the complicated, ongoing work of being an ancient civilization confronting its own present tense. And the seal sat on the table between 2 people who had each, in different ways and from different distances, arrived at this particular room without planning to, and found, with the specific surprise of things that should not work but do, that the room fit.